Soc la Martina Millà i llegiré el text de James Johnson Sweeney del catàleg de l'exposició que es va fer al MoMA l'any 41, al MoMA de Nova York, i James Johnson Sweeney en va ser el comissari. Em sembla que és la primera vegada que Miró exposa al MoMA, l'any 41, i és una exposició que va tenir un impacte transcendental, diria jo, en els joves artistes nord-americans i per tant va ser clau en una certa evolució o un cert desenvolupament de la història de l'art de la segona meitat del segle XX. James Johnson Sweeney, Joan, que suposo que ell pronunciava Joan Miró, sense accent, Joan Miró. Gaiety, sunshine, health, color, humor, rhythm, these are the notes which characterize the work of Joan Miró. Joan Miró is above else a painter. This is what distinguishes him from so many of his best-known contemporaries. This is the key to his own stylistic evolution. This is the basis on which he has built the most revolutionary contribution made within the strictly pictorial form by any painter of the generation immediately following that of Pablo Picasso. But Miró is also a poet. What really counts, he has said, is to strip the soul naked. Painting or poetry is made as we make love. A total embrace, prudence thrown to the wind, nothing held back. Have you ever heard of greater nonsense than the aims of the abstractionist group? And they invite me to share their deserted house as if the signs that I transcribe on a canvas, at the moment when they correspond to a concrete representation of my mind, were not profoundly real and did not belong essentially to the world of reality. As a matter of fact, I am attaching more and more importance to the subject matter of my work. To me, it seems vital that a rich and robust theme should be present to give the spectator an immediate blow between the eyes, before a second thought can interpose. In this way, poetry, pictorially expressed, speaks its own language. For 1,000 men of letters, give me one poet. End quote. These are the ideals which give Miró's work its character and have dominated his evolution as a painter. To follow his growth is to follow the pattern of his efforts towards embodying these ideals in his art. The need of Miró's generation was a recall of the imagination to painting. In combating the abuses which had derived from an exaggerated interest in the descriptive possibilities of painting, Miró's immediate seniors, the Cubists and others, had gone dangerously far in the direction of denying those features any value whatsoever. The young men of the early 1920s recognized the importance of a renewed stress on spiritual values in painting. This new romantic spirit, however, demanded a fresh field. Psychoanalytic research and the unfamiliar words of free, irrational association which it revealed offered a suggestion. It was eagerly accepted. But in reacting against the Cubist exaggerated emphasis on formal fundamentals, many of the most talented surrealist painters forgot the lessons that the previous generation had learned. Miró, however, was an exception. Thanks to his almost all-exclusive interest in painting, he has been able to keep his finger on the benefits that the severe disciplines of the earlier generation had won, and at the same time meet the problem of his own generation with an equal or even greater effectiveness than any of his contemporaries. As André Breton, one of the founders of the Surrealist movement, stated in its heyday, quote, "There is in Joan Miró apparently only one interest, that of giving himself over entirely to painting and only to painting. with that pure automatism on which I, for my part, have never stopped calling, and of which Miró seems to have found out for himself, in short order, the sound value and good sense. Perhaps, indeed, on these grounds, he may be regarded as the most thorough surrealist of all of us. The most thorough surrealist of all of us. End quote. In his work, Miró is essentially a Catalan, that type of fantasist visionary which, in the Middle Ages, produced the manuscript illuminations of Beatus' commentaries on the Apocalypse, that mixture of Oriental and Occidental sympathies which made it possible for Raymond Lully in the 13th century to open up the vernacular to the paths of philosophy through exploitation of two cultures, Latin and Arabian, which existed side by side in the Catalonia of his day. Miró's color rarely offers the somber tonalities we associate with so much Spanish painting, particularly that of the great masters of the post-Renaissance, El Greco, Zurbarán, Velázquez, and Goya. He has a blither note. In it, there are echoes of the early provincial church decorators of Catalonia, frequently the bold contrast of yellows, blues, scarlets, and greens of the Beatus backgrounds. Throughout, we feel the gay spirit of contemporary Catalonian folk art. Within the rhythms of his compositions, the slow movements of a Spanish dance will suddenly burst into those of a Catalan sardana with its intoxicating swing and wistful skirl of pipes. Because of his fundamental devotion to painting, Miró has been able to recognize the value of the lessons learned by those generations immediately preceding his, who sternly emphasized the formal basis of painting. Because he was a poet, he saw the weakness of a pictorial expression which discouraged any enrichment by means of extra-pictorial suggestion. Through the combination of these two sides of his talent, he has been able to bring a new tonic element into contemporary painting without compromising an essential pictorial approach. And the record of Miró's development to date is a history of the constant, single-minded effort he has made toward combining and perfecting these abilities. Joan Miró was born at Mont-roig, near Barcelona, on April 20th, 1893. At the age of 14, he entered the School of Fine Arts in Barcelona. He was not a quick pupil, and his earliest efforts were discouraging to his parents. After 3 years, they prevailed on him to give up art school for a position in an office. Between 1910 and 1912, Miró did no painting whatsoever. In 1912, however, he took it up again and entered the Academy Galí at Barcelona. Since 1915, he has devoted himself entirely to painting. In Miró's early development, an important role was played by the sympathetic insight of two of his first teachers. Urgell, his professor at the School of Fine Arts, was prompt to recognize certain qualities of Miró's self-contained nature. He encouraged the observant, reflective side of Miró's character and fostered a natural contentment in solitude that distinguishes Miró even today. A later master, Pasco, Miró recalls, encouraged him to take every possible liberty necessary to finding his individual path, exerting pressure only in developing Miró's feeling for color. Molt llarg. És que, bueno, i continua, però... Sí. Bueno, puc continuar, Però...
Està bé, molt bé. Gràcies.
Espera, pues això.
No, això
poder veure? Va, som-hi. Va, que ara ens anem a París, va. Ja podem marxar, tothom. Ja podeu marxar. Ens anem a París, va. Sí, aneu en pau, doneu-vos la pau, allò, la pau, sí, exacte.
L'escala de l'evasió.
La pau.
La dona, l'home, l'ocell.
A veure, ara he perdut el punt. A veure... Va, no, 1912. Bueno, em salto 1912 a 1920 i me'n vaig a París, vale?
Vale.
Va. I ajusto això per les meves progressives. Va, només llegiré els primers, això, 20-25, que inclou la masia. I serà estupendo. Que llarg. Bueno, no sé si arribaré fins a la masia. Ui, perquè sí, lo de París no s'acaba mai. Carai, no sé quant, per 20-25 li dona la tira de pàgines. I després 25-27, que és una meravella, també. Però va, 20-25 i punta pelota. 1920-1925. In April of 1921, Dalmau organized Miró's first one-man show in Paris at the Galerie La Licorne under the sponsorship of the critic Maurice Raynal, who contributed the preface to the catalogue. Raynal liked Miró's work even at this early date. He and Picasso brought Paul Rosenberg to see him in the early months of 1921. Raynal thoroughly understood Miró's temperament and appreciated his audacities, which he felt were, quote-unquote, never irritating. In fact, he encouraged his harshness as a, quote, source of those fertile errors which have so often illuminated art, end quote. In the Paris show, 29 canvases and 15 drawings dating from 1917 to 1920 were shown. Nothing was sold. For Miró, a long period of hardship and poverty followed, which was to be brought to a close only by the sensational success of his exhibition at Pierre Loeb's gallery in the Rue Bonaparte in 1925. The period 1920-1925 was perhaps the most important in Miró's development. In it, he was, at first, trying to perfect his technique. He satisfied his desire for objective representation in the farm, La Masia. Then he gradually broke down conventional forms into a more individual idiom, and finally he achieved sufficient confidence to wipe his canvas bare for new explorations. But it is not to be supposed that Miró undertook any of these steps in his evolution according to a conscious program. Even the changes from the loose fauve technique of his early years to that of his 1919 self-portrait were more intuitive than reasoned. As he says himself, quote, "It is always passion and faith which lead me on. I change my painting often in search of means of expression. It is always this burning passion which guides me, which makes me walk from left to right," end quote. This is undoubtedly true. Nevertheless, the line of his evolution is remarkably straight, much more direct, probably, than if it had been based on a seasoned criticism. Those strayings from right to left, which he speaks of, are only superficial. Out of the fanatic concentration in his apprentice years on perfecting his means of expression, his persistent effort to compose every picture as well as possible, to balance all the elements and harmonize the color and drawing, came a sense of pictorial rightness, which guided him more effectively than any rationalization could. At the same time, another, even deeper urge moved him. This was his desire to ally poetry with painting, to give a spiritual color, a suggestive quality to his pictures. He realized this could not be achieved so fully as he desired through the use of conventional descriptive forms. In the important 1920 still lifes, such as the still life with rabbit, and in such works as the 1921 portrait of a Spanish dancer, is to be found the fullest development of Miró's objective self-discipline. Just as the landscape with olive trees was a broadening and strengthening of the landscape with donkey, the still life with rabbit is clearly an outgrowth of the lessons Miró learned through the landscape with olive trees. And the portrait of a Spanish dancer, in the same way, offers a crispness of drawing and modeling that carries us along in technique and technical achievement to the end of this phase of Miró's evolution and the farm of 1921-1922. All this, however, was primarily a sharpening of tools. And temperamentally, Miró could not be satisfied with that alone. He wanted to be sure of his tools and confident in his idiom, but not solely for their own sakes. He wanted to be able to say something with them, not merely to describe something, and say something with them completely, even scientifically. But strangely enough, it was Miró's concentration on the objective world closest to him at this time that was eventually to serve as the bridge from a straightforward craftsman-like description of material models to a subjective world of association, sentiment, and finally of fantasy. That bridge was the farm of 1921-1922, which Miró began to paint sur le motif at Mont-Roig, continued in Barcelona, and finished in Paris after 9 months of steady work, much hardship, and in the end, undoubtedly, many a nostalgic backward glance toward the original subject matter. This picture is the master key to much of Miró's later development. It represents the objective source of long series of fantastic variations, both on its general theme and on elements selected from it, dating from its conclusion practically to the present day. Like Dublin to James Joyce, in his continental exile, the homestead of Mont-Roig, where Miró was born, served him as a base on which to build his fantasies and dreams far away in Paris. And we can see the persistent spell of this memory in the development, simplification, and elaboration of references to the farm that turn up in Miró's work from the tilled field of 1922 to 1923 through the family of 1924, the Harlequin's Carnival of 1924-25, the Dutch interiors of 1928, and the large 1933 compositions, even down to 1940, when the Mont-Roig rooster becomes the Gallic cock in a gouache prepared for the review Verbe, just before the fall of France. The farm, in Miró's work, represents the close of his first period of discipline and the opening of the period in which he adapts his hard-won technique to new ends of expression. In the farm, we first find as great an interest in the subjective as in the objective. A poetry of sentiment, a nostalgia suffuses the picture. Robert Desnos, in describing Miró's studio in the Rue Blomet, that year writes, quote, "The farm was the first of his pictures I saw. It lighted up his whole whitewashed studio. One wall was completely hidden by huge bare canvases. It was a fine day. The sun gave the weedy, miserable court a lovely country charm. In one corner of the studio was a table covered with Balearic toys, little gnomes, strange animals in plaster, illuminated in lively colors. These little creatures seemed to have come out of the farm. They gave the studio a holiday, fairy tale air, and I tried in vain to rack my brains for a memory of which I was only able to call back the ghost, the savor, so to speak, a childhood tale in which mushrooms played the principal roles, end quote. Això tan maco és de Robert Desnos, que no sé si es pronuncia més a final o no. End quote. The drawing in the farm is as crisp as in the portrait of a Spanish dancer, and the composition even denser than that of the still life with rabbit. The colors have a cold austerity with a curious relation to Spanish popular prints in their yellows, tobacco browns, blacks, and greens. Every detail is worked out with meticulous care. Every crack in the plaster, every leaf, every loose stone is painted as if it alone were important. Miró has made use of every variety of linear pattern, from the moss-grown plaster of the barn to the grain in the wood of the dove cote and the dog's footprints in the path. At the same time, he has organized a rich pattern of related motifs built around the black circle at the foot of the central tree and the triangle of tiles beside it. We find every conceivable variation of each of these dominant forms throughout the picture. The circle is frankly repeated in the sun and the hen's nest, and elliptically in the various pails and cans scattered about the farmyard. The triangle of the tiles is repeated immediately alongside in a black shadow, again in the gables of the barn and tool shed, then echoed throughout every corner of the canvas, from the reflection of the chicken netting to the disused tiles in the extreme right foreground. The farm, La Masia, is a synthesis of Miró's objective interest up to that time. The few frankly objective studies that appear in 1922 and 1923, such as the flower still lifes, the ear of grain, and the carbide lamp, are bits left behind in the cornucopia after the farm. Left behind in the cornucopia after the farm had been poured out, rather than contributions toward a future culminating work. The most important of these fragments from the farm is The Farmer's Wife of 1923, which broadens and simplifies certain rhythms and forms of the parent picture. Instead of the dominant black circle and triangle, there is now a dominant white circle and triangle with variations in the black lines framing the woman and the black shape of the stuffed button. The grotesquely exaggerated feet, the elimination of depth, and the generally more abstract style of The Farmer's Wife indicate Miró's direction. However, the broad simplicity of The Ear of Grain and The Farmer's Wife is temporarily forgotten in the works immediately following, to reappear as one of the dominant characteristics of Miró's style of the mid-1920s. The farm, La Masia, marks the beginning of a new interest in sentiment and associative suggestion. The poetic approach, which is to play such an important role in his subsequent work. His next ambitious composition, The Tilled Field of 1923-1924, again has the same nostalgic theme, but treated with much greater freedom and less objective realism. Here we have a beginning of the elisions, the suggestive shorthand, which is to characterize his idiom more and more. While the farm was founded on observation and developed after the painter's eye had been withdrawn from the model, he approaches the tilled field through his associational memory rather than his visual memory. From now on, he is no longer interested in how a scene actually looked. He is interested rather in that of which it reminds him. Instead of attempting to describe, he now sets about noting down these resemblances and suggestions. The result begins at once to take on the character of a pictorial metaphor rather than a representation. For example, in the tilt field, he evidently cares less about the appearance of the scene than his awareness of the listening quiet symbolized by the great ear, and the eyes watching him from every corner, the rural calm and the live animality he associates with Montrouge. This was one side of Miró's development. Two other important features were an increased abstraction of form and a greater complexity of compositional rhythms. The tilt field was a recognizable advance in abstraction, yet for all the formal exaggeration employed, the composition remains relatively simple. It is rather the Catalan landscape of the same year that marks a distinct advance in this direction. Here, Miró's formal simplifications carry him, in many instances, to the barest of ideographs, most of them linear. At the same time, in keeping with general attenuation of forms, we have a thinning of color, both in tone and in application, pale pinks, oranges, and yellows, in contrast to the warm reds, greens, browns, and blues of the tilt field. A light wash instead of the earlier thicker paint. Up to this point, Miró's growth seems mainly the outcome of changes within himself and consequent reinterpretations of the formal researches of his predecessors. With the Catalan landscape, we begin to see the influence of contemporary art movements around him in Paris. His incorporation of the letters S, A, R, D, for example, has a clear Dadaistic character as a commentary on the subject matter. In the farm and the tilt field, he had employed fragments of the newspaper titles L'Intransigeant et Le Journal, but in those pictures they were used as in Cubism. While the letters S, A, R, D still function as formal elements in the composition, they also play an extra pictorial role. As an abbreviation of Sardana, the popular national dance of Catalonia, they suggest both the holiday spirit in which the picture should be approached and the associations it offered with the painter's native land. Again, in keeping with his nostalgia, we see his native flag linked with that of the country of his residence, Catalonia, France. The wheel and the ladder motifs from the farm reappear, and we recognize the painter's palette in the lower left-hand corner. Sentiment gives Miró his theme, and his contacts with the Dada movement give him an idiom for understatement and a certain mild self-mockery. The moustached figure smoking a pipe in the upper left-hand corner, probably intended as a self-portrait, is a character which will reappear constantly during the next year and a half until its final appearance in the Harlequin's Carnival. The long discipline which Miró's work on the farm, La Masia, entailed had burned it into his memory. It is not likely that distance diminished his sentimental feeling, but maturity undoubtedly refined it. Possibly this is why each new metamorphosis of a motive from the farm grows less realistic, yet seems to carry with it a greater aura of suggestion. And with these changes of form and feeling, there is a related change in color. The fact that the artist is no longer interested in description so much as in suggestion has produced a profound change in his total pictorial organization, which has already begun to turn away from a conventional central axis to an all-over disposition of flowing rhythms, as in the Catalan landscape. Ever since Miró's arrival in Paris, he had been closely in touch with the younger men there, to whom his fellow countryman Picasso had introduced him. Pablo Gargallo's studio, which he took over, was separated only by a thin partition from that of André Masson, one of the most active of the younger generation of painters, conscious of a need to find a way from the cubism of his predecessors to a more emotional expression. There, as Desnos described it, quote, "Many of the younger poets and writers were accustomed together," end quote. Georges Lambourg, Frankel, Léry, Salacreux, Viau, and others. The era was full of controversy and new ideas. In 1920, the Dadaists gave their first public demonstration in Paris at the Palais des Fêtes. Poems were read, music played, and sculpture and painting exhibited. Notably, Duchamp's Elle a chaud au cou. Q. Mona Lisa with a mustache, which aroused considerable indignation by their artificial madness. Many of the leading Dadaists, Picabia, Max Ernst, and Ripemont Desanges, among others, held one-man shows at the Saint-Pareil. Later in the year, a Dada festival was held at the Salle Gaveau. The following year, 1921, was marked by the publication of The Magnetic Fields, a collection of automatic writings by André Breton and Philippe Soupeau. In 1922, a large international exhibition was arranged by the Orthodox Dadaists of the Galerie Montaigne. The outcome of all these activities was the publication in 1924 of the first Manifesto of Surrealism by André Breton, in which he gives the definition, quote, surrealism, noun, pure psychic automatism by which it is intended to express verbally, in writing or by other means, the real process of thought, thought's dictation, all exercise of reason, every aesthetic or moral preoccupation being absent, end quote. And Miró tells us that during the year 1924 and 1925, quote, I went about a great deal with poets because I thought one must go beyond form to achieve poetry, end quote. Miró's constant aim since the farm of 1922, La Masia, had been the creation of a vocabulary of pictorial symbols suggestive enough to bring with them a rich overtone of extra-pictorial associations. His Dadaistic, in reverse, marked a broad step from the Catalan landscape in this direction, and his pastoral of 1924 went even further in the elimination of realistic details. In The Family of the same year, we find a skeletal symbolic anticipation of the Harlequin's Carnival of 1924-1925, and in Maternity, an even starker simplification of the central figure of the family, given a quality of suggestion such as will later characterize Miró's whole production. However, the culmination of this period of Miró's development is the Harlequin's Carnival. Just as the farm, La Masia, had summed up his efforts at objective description, the Harlequin's Carnival may be said to sum up his experiments in subjective description. In it we see distortions of those now familiar motifs which made their first important appearance in La Masia, the farm. The ladder, the year. Ja està, ja estic acabat.
No, acaba.
Ahí està.
Sí, perquè
Ai, perdona, hòstia!
Que ja estàs passant de temps.
Hòstia,